It all started with a fight between two little girls. Just a slap. Just a harsh word. That was it. At least that's how it seemed at first. But sometimes the smallest things spark the biggest fires. And this fire would burn through the streets of Limerick for decades. Over 20 murders. Countless shootings. Homes riddled with bullets. Streets once quiet became battlefields. But most people thought it was just another gang war. They were wrong. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about territory. Not even about drugs. It was about hatred. Pure, unrelenting hatred. And it all started with something so small you'd barely believe it. Limerick was once charming. A city full of life. People walked its streets without fear. Families went to school, children played in the parks, pubs were full of laughter. But by the 1990s that was changing. Limerick had earned a new name, Stab City. It wasn't just a nickname. It was a warning. Violence had seeped into every corner. From crumbling housing estates to quiet suburban streets. Fear was everywhere. The city had been struggling for years. Poverty was widespread. Jobs were scarce. Young people, especially those under 30, had few options. Unemployment was high. Families struggled to put food on the table. Desperation bred crime. And crime bred gangs. It wasn't instant. It started slowly. Petty theft, shoplifting, small scuffles. But it grew. Then came the drugs. Heroin. Cocaine. Ecstasy. The kind of drugs that could ruin a city if they weren't controlled. And that's exactly what happened. Where there's drugs, there's money. And where there's money, there's power. Someone had to take control. Enter Christy Keene. Late 40s at the time. A man with ambition. A man with ruthlessness. He built the Keene Colopy gang from the ground up. South Hill, St. Mary's Park. These neighborhoods were his domain. Christy controlled them with precision. He had enforcers. He had dealers. He had influence. Businesses paid protection money. Anyone who challenged him learned fast what fear could do. The law kept its distance. But Christy wasn't alone in ambition. Eddie Ryan, early 40s, was once his right-hand man. Charismatic. Bold. Ruthless in his own way. But he wasn't as calculating as Christy. He had drive, but sometimes he let his temper lead. Where Christy planned, Eddie reacted. And that difference would change everything. They were inseparable in the late 1990s. Allies. Partners. Friends. They built an empire together. But tension simmered underneath. Christy had control. Eddie wanted more. Power. Recognition. Respect. Every day their partnership frayed a little more. The cracks were invisible at first. Subtle. But growing. Something small was waiting to break the dam. And then it happened. Their daughters. Just kids. A fight. A scratch across the face. Innocent? Maybe. But to Christy and Eddie it was personal. Pride. Respect. Honor. Lines were crossed. The friendship could not survive that insult. By the way, if you have enjoyed the story so far, please don't forget to subscribe, like and share this video as it will encourage us to create more videos on UK organized crime. By November 2000, the tension exploded. Christy sat in his car outside his child's school. Waiting. Thinking. Watching. Eddie approached. Gun in hand. Aim steady. Aimed at Christy. Click. The gun jammed. Christy escaped. Alive. But that was the message. The war had begun. 2 nights later, November 12, 2000, Eddie Ryan sat in the Moose Bar on Cathedral Place. A familiar place. A place he thought was safe. 2 masked gunmen stormed in. Automatic weapons. Bullets sprayed everywhere. Eddie was shot point blank. Patrons ducked and screamed. The bar's front wall was riddled with holes. A public declaration of war. Eddie's young son had gone to the restroom minutes earlier. He survived by chance. But Eddie didn't. With his death, the city changed. Alliances formed. Lines were drawn. Christy Keene on one side. Eddie Ryan's relatives on the other. Among them, the McCarthy Dundons. Brothers Wayne, John, and Gerard. Young men in their 20s and 30s. Raised in England. Returned to Limerick in the 1990s. Ambitious. Ruthless. Opportunistic. They saw the chaos as a chance. The Dundons allied with the Ryan faction. But secretly they had their own plans. They had once supplied guns to Christy Keene. Now they played both sides. Double crosses. Betrayals. The perfect storm for one of Limerick's most gruesome chapters. January 2003. Eddie Ryan's sons vanished. Eddie Jr., 20, and Kieran, 19, disappeared from Moira Road. Rumors spread. Abduction. Murder. Christy Keene thought he had control. But the truth? The sons were unharmed. The kidnapping was a ruse. A trap for Christie's brother, Kieran Keane. On January 29, Kieran Keane, 36, and his associate Owen Trice, 25, were lured to a house in Garryowen. They thought they would witness the Ryan brothers' fate. Instead they were ambushed, captured, bound, beat, stabbed. Kieran Keane was stabbed in the face and shot execution-style in the back of the head. Owen Trice was stabbed 17 times. Left for dead. Miraculously, he survived and crawled to a nearby house for help. The Ryan brothers walked into a police station unharmed the next day. The double cross worked. Christie's brother was dead. The McCarthy Dundons had struck a deadly blow. The Keane Colopy gang reeled. But the feud was only beginning. Retaliation was coming. Violence spread. Young men barely 18 or 19 were armed and sent to fight. Pipe bombs. Drive-by shootings. Stabbings. Limerick streets became war zones. The smallest insults could ignite revenge. The feud had grown bigger than Christie and Eddie. Bigger than drugs. Bigger than money. It had taken on a life of its own. And it all started with a slap. By July 2003 the violence was escalating. John Ryan, Eddie Ryan's older brother, was 47 years old. He had survived the feud for years, but that summer his luck ran out. He was walking outside a house in Mangate when two teenage gunmen on a motorcycle appeared. They rode past, guns raised. Bullets tore through the air. John Ryan fell instantly. There was no time to react. It was brutal. Cold-blooded. Another warning from the McCarthy Dundons. If you were connected to the Ryan family, you were a target. Everyone in the city knew it. At the same time, the Keane Colopy gang wasn't backing down. They struck back. Retaliation became the rule of the streets. Later that year, in October 2003, Michael Mike McNamara, 23, a known member of the Keane gang, vanished. His friends reported him missing. No one expected the truth. Weeks later, his body was found in South Hill, bound and mutilated. He had been stabbed multiple times and shot twice. The McCarthy Dundons sent a message. This was about power. About fear. About proving dominance. No one was safe. The streets of Limerick had turned into war zones. Guns, knives, and pipe bombs became everyday tools. The violence didn't discriminate. Even families of gang members were at risk. Innocent people were caught in the middle. Small mistakes could cost you your life. Every attack escalated the cycle. Each death fueled more anger, more revenge. A new generation of young men was emerging. Some were barely 18 or 19. They were recruited by the gangs to fight. They were reckless, fearless, and hardened by the violence around them. These were kids who had grown up in the shadows of war. Guns became familiar. Killing became routine. They weren't just fighting for the gangs. They were fighting for survival. And they were more dangerous than anyone had seen before. By 2004, Limerick was a city under siege. Violence was no longer just gang to gang. Innocent lives were at stake. People stopped walking the streets after dark. Shops closed early. Parents kept their children inside. Fear became normal. It was impossible to escape. Tragedy continued. In 2006, Noel Crawford, 40, was walking home in South Hill. He had no connection to the feud. He wasn't part of any gang. But that didn't matter. A bullet meant for his brother, a minor player connected to the McCarthy Dundons, struck him instead. He died instantly. Innocent. Unprepared. His murder was a reminder to the city. The feud spared no one. Violence escalated further. That same year, a car was firebombed in Moira, and 2 young children were severely burned. The attack was deliberate. The gangs wanted attention. They wanted fear to spread. The public was outraged. National outrage. People demanded action. This wasn't just gang violence. It was terror. Law enforcement tried to respond. The Garter increased patrols. Armed checkpoints were set up across Limerick. Raids became routine. Over 250 firearms were seized in 2 years. But the gangs adapted. They moved faster. They became more secretive. Older men led from behind the scenes. Younger men executed the violence. The hatred was stronger than fear. By 2007, over 100 shootings had been recorded in Limerick. The city was paralyzed by fear. Homes were riddled with bullets. Parents kept children inside. Shops boarded up their windows. Even when the police were present, no one felt safe. The gangs were methodical, calculating. Every hit, every attack sent a message: challenge us and you will die. Social media worsened the situation. Platforms like Bebo and early Facebook were used to post threats. Gangs taunted each other. Videos, photos, coded messages, all part of the intimidation. The feud was now public. The streets were dangerous, but online it was everywhere. Fear followed people home. No one was safe. The breaking point came in November 2008. Shane Geoghegan, 28, a rugby player, a normal young man with no gang connections, was walking home after a match. A hitman had orders to kill John McNamara, a known gang ally. But Shane looked like the target. Bullets tore through the night. Shane collapsed, dead on the curb. The city was stunned. Outrage spread fast. This wasn't gang-on-gang violence. This was innocent blood. Before we continue, don't forget that what you are watching took us hours of both research, editing and voicing to able to get it across to you. We plead that you show us your support by just subscribing to this channel and liking this video, as it will encourage us to create more video like this. Thank you. The murder of Shane Geoghegan finally sparked action. Steve Collins and his wife Carmel became public symbols of resistance. Steve's father had already testified against the Dundons in 2004, risking his life. Now the family became the face of the fight for justice. The community rallied. Thousands joined marches against the gangs. Enough was enough. The government responded. Justice Minister Dermot Ahern introduced the Criminal Justice Amendment Act 2009. Police were now allowed to target gang leaders directly, even if they were in prison. Wayne Dundon and John Dundon had been controlling Limerick from behind bars. Now they could be prosecuted for orders they gave from prison. Police tactics changed. Raids increased. Armed checkpoints were everywhere. Operations became coordinated. In April 2013, over 250 officers executed synchronized raids across Limerick, Clare, and Tipperary. Drugs, cash, weapons were all seized. The net was closing on the gangs. Yet the price had been high. Families were traumatized. Fear remained. The city had been scarred for generations. Witnesses stepped forward, thanks to protection programs. April Collins testified against John Dundon, helping secure convictions. Slowly the tide turned. By 2013 the Dundons were convicted. Their power crumbled. The gangs, once untouchable, were now shadows of their former selves. The city finally began to breathe. But Limerick's scars would remain. The feud had changed the city forever. Even with victories, the story wasn't over. The city had rebuilt, but younger criminals were still learning from the old guard. The lessons of violence, hatred, and retaliation hadn't disappeared. The feud had ended, but its legacy lingered in every street corner and alley of Limerick, a stark reminder of the war that once consumed the city. By June 2015, the violence that had defined Limerick for over a decade had not completely ended. The city had seen some of its most dangerous figures imprisoned, and the streets had grown quieter, but danger still lingered. One of the last major players, Christy Keane, was no longer untouchable. He had survived years of attacks, gang wars, and assassination attempts, but on that day in June his luck nearly ran out. Christy, 54 years old, was parked at the University of Limerick waiting for a meeting when everything changed. Two masked gunmen appeared, emerging from the shadows with weapons ready. Shots rang out. Bullets ripped through the air. Christy reacted instinctively. He dove behind his car and scrambled across a nearby field, taking cover wherever he could. Despite being hit multiple times in the arm and torso, he survived. His attackers disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, leaving chaos in their wake. Miraculously he walked away. But the message was clear: the feud had not forgotten him. His empire, once unchallenged and feared across Limerick, was no longer secure. Even as Christy Keane survived, the city began to change. The McCarthy Dundons were being dismantled, and the Keane Colopy gang had lost its grip. But this didn't happen overnight. Years of painstaking work by the Garter had chipped away at the gangs, one arrest at a time. They had gathered intelligence, infiltrated networks, and slowly built cases against the leaders. Each operation required planning, patience, and courage. The police had to work around fear, threats, and secrecy. Many witnesses had been too terrified to speak, knowing that one wrong word could cost their lives. And yet, some stepped forward. One of the most pivotal was April Collins, who became a key witness in the Roy Collins murder case. She testified against Wayne Dundon, recounting the events in painstaking detail. Her courage, along with the protection she received through the Witness Protection Program, allowed the justice system to function. Without brave people like her, convictions for murders and other violent crimes would have been impossible. By the end of 2014, justice had begun to take shape. Wayne Dundon was sentenced to life in prison for orchestrating the murder of Roy Collins. His brother, John Dundon, was already serving time for ordering the killing of Shane Geoghegan. The old guard of the McCarthy Dundons and the Keane Colopy gang had been stripped of their power. Christy Keane remained alive, but he was no longer untouchable. The city had begun to reclaim itself from the grip of violence. Even so, Limerick was far from healed. There were still players in the shadows, gang members who had escaped justice, and younger criminals eager to fill the void. The streets were calmer, but tension lingered. The community was cautious. Parents still watched their children closely. Shops still boarded windows in certain neighborhoods. The scars of over a decade of bloodshed didn't fade overnight. Amidst all this, the citizens of Limerick began to take a stand. The Collins family became a symbol of resilience and courage. After Roy's murder, Steve Collins and his wife Carmel refused to be intimidated. They led marches through the streets, speaking out against gang violence and inspiring thousands to join them. These marches weren't just about mourning a loved one. They were about reclaiming a city. They were about sending a message to the gangs: we will no longer live in fear. Alongside community efforts, programs for youth began to take root. The Shane Geoghegan Trust, created by Shane's family and supported by local sports figures, offered alternatives to crime for at-risk youth. Sports, art, and educational activities became lifelines for young people growing up in neighborhoods once dominated by fear. Slowly, a new generation learned that there were other paths. They could choose sports over gangs, creativity over violence, and education over crime. Infrastructure improvements also became a priority. Areas like South Hill and St. Mary's Park received attention for the first time in decades. Housing projects were rebuilt. Streets were cleaned. Communities were given a chance to recover. These changes weren't just cosmetic. They were meant to restore hope, to break the cycle of violence and poverty that had allowed the gangs to thrive. Law enforcement continued to play a critical role. The National Organized Crime Unit targeted remaining gang members, while the Criminal Assets Bureau (CAB) seized properties, luxury cars, and bank accounts tied to criminal activity. By stripping the gangs of their wealth, authorities weakened their power and influence. The city was finally starting to breathe again. Yet even as progress was made, the legacy of the feud lingered. Families who had been connected to the old gangs still passed down stories of power, survival, and violence. Some children grew up idolizing their parents' reputations. And in 2020 and 2021, incidents of car bombings, arson, and assaults reminded everyone that the threat was never fully gone. New gangs emerged, hungry for influence, attempting to recreate the chaos that once dominated the streets. Despite these challenges, there was hope. Youth programs continued to grow. The community's voice remained strong. The law had new tools and better strategies to prevent large-scale violence. Limerick had survived the worst, but the question remained: could it fully escape the shadow of its past, or was it only a matter of time before violence resurfaced? The story of Limerick is far from over. The city is healing, but the work isn't finished. New generations are growing up in a city scarred by bloodshed. Lessons have been learned. But old habits die hard. The feud may have been dismantled, but its memory still influences the streets, the youth, and even those who survived it. And so, the question lingers: can Limerick sustain its recovery, or will new forces rise to challenge the peace that has been fought so hard to achieve?